This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs. Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com or, of course, follow us on Twitter at FilmmakerU. Each week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week I'm joined by colorist Alex Gascoigne, whose work includes The Rig, Endeavor, and more recently, Black Mirror, just to name a few. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I have to ask, because I was reading your bio and you said you sort of got into color correction when you were developing film, like actually hand processing film by the sounds of it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so I studied graphic design at university, and we did a lot of, it was a lot of print design, logos, illustration, but we had a sort of black and white photography course, but shooting on film. And so we were, developing with chemicals and, in the dark room, enlarging, our pictures, and that's kind of where I started learning about apertures and exposures and how to really process film properly. So I think that was quite a good grounding for me in the job I do now. I mean, everything we do now is pretty much all digital. The odd film comes through the door, but much less than at the start of my career. But it was a great way just to start getting an understanding of light and contrast and just what was possible with film and how you could manipulate it after the fact.
Yeah. No, did you do it with you were just doing 35mm stills? You never went into 16mm black and white, or?
It was mostly 35mm stills. Yeah. And then when I did my master's in film, we were shooting 16mm color film. And then that was getting processed at a lab in Soho at the time.
So how did you make the transition from there into color correction?
That's a good question. Well, because I think at various points in my life, I always knew I wanted to work in film in some way. When I was a teenager, I probably wanted to work more in sort of visual effects. I loved the work of ILM and the stuff they were doing, with spacecrafts or whatever it was. That sort of big visual effects work. And then I think at various points I've harbored desires to direct or be a DP. But then I think when I was doing my master's in shooting film, although I really enjoyed that process of capturing images on set, and then we, send it off to the lab and it would come back and they'd do like a one light transfer, and you kind of find all the mistakes that you made on set. And then we bring it into the Avid, start editing. And it was really at that time I started finding that you could do a lot in post-production in terms of color. And, when I was making short films and you have, kind of aspirations of making everything look like, Amelie or something like that. And you kind of want that kind of those gold tones and things, and maybe not getting that quite right on the day. And then it was, you find out, oh, you can make changes further down the line. And I think I found an affinity with that. In my graphic design days, I'd done a lot of work with Photoshop and Lightroom and, manipulating stills images. And I just found my sensibilities with the computer and visually just sort of worked well in that sort of post-production side of things rather than in production. So after my master's, I got a job as a runner at a company in Soho called Pepper, and started training with the colorists that were there. And at that time, when I joined in the sort of early to mid 2000s, there was still a lot of work on film. All the features were shot on film, and TV was kind of a mixture of film and digital. So my first experiences in post-production in a professional sense was handling rolls of film, running them through the film cleaner, and the role of an assistant was lacing up different rolls of film, and they'd work on those, and then you'd swap the film over, and that was all being transferred to tape. And it was only a year or two into my career that the company I was at invested in these new coder systems that were all digital, and then I started learning those, and my career kind of progressed from there.
I think what attracted me to color correction was the fact that we were like the next stage of cinematography. And the creative side was huge, trying to understand what was wrong with an image, how to balance it, trying to understand how to let the tools do what you want them to do. Where else can the technology go? What else can we do? I'm very interested in trying to mold the image and create the best look possible. And whatever tools are out there, you want to try and latch onto them. I'm Eric Whipp, and this is my course on color correction.
Now you mentioned Amelie, so
Yeah.
I there was sort of this era around that time, because it was like Run Lola Run came out, Amelie, and they all had very unique like looks to them, very unique color. Like whenever I think of Run Lola Run, I think of like the red in her hair and all that stuff, and when I think of Amelie, I think of the really saturated greens and colors in there. So is there a particular film that you sort of gravitated to, or sort of inspired you when you were younger, or was there a group of films?
From a visual perspective, definitely Blade Runner. I remember the first time I saw that with my dad, and that would have been kind of probably early 90s on a VHS tape, I think. And but just the visuals immediately really stood out. Use of color. Those films, Amelie that I mentioned, those films and that era in the kind of late 90s and early 2000s, especially with the birth of DI, as it became of taking a physical medium of film, digitizing it, and then manipulating it in all these ways that were far more extensive than when you were processing film in the lab, and you were much more limited in the control you had. And in the early days of film, those creative choices were made on set, and with the choice of film print and so on. And then suddenly in a digital world, you can kind of, do all of that. You've got a lot more control over that in the DI. So I think in the early 2000s, there were a lot of films really sort of pushing the boundaries of where you could take that. And now I think my job is to, I'm finding that the projects that I work on now, some of them want those really bold, strong looks, and others want to be far more naturalistic. And so I think my job as a colorist is to sort of figure out what the boundaries are of any project you're doing, and how far can we take this. And often that's those first few hours of the first morning of the first day's grade, is that time where you want to sort of mess about, and you sit down with the DP or the director, and you kind of go, right, this is where we can take it. How far do we want to go, or do we want to pull it back a little bit? And it's always a bit of a balancing act on, with every project that you do.
Well, you kind of mentioned something here, and that is, originally we were doing color timing, and you'd come in and run through, and you'd go up a stop, down a stop, depending on the colors. And now it's like before the cinematographer would be there for that, but now it's like a huge job in terms of like you're going, shot by shot, and like minute details are being explored. And so it's become a partnership with the cinematographer. So how do you like to work with them? How do you like to sort of start a project with a new cinematographer?
I like to get involved as early as possible in a project. I mean, the sort of shows that we do, especially the Amazon, Netflix, Disney type shows, where the production company will come to us or to myself and say, look, can we get you set up with the cinematographer for a chat? Sometimes it's just a phone call. Sometimes they'll come in with some lens or camera tests that they've done, and we'll sit down and start discussing the script. And we'll start just throwing out some ideas before they've been out on the shoot of just where they're thinking of taking the show. And then, maybe we build a LUT, or we start looking at some references that they might be using. And we sort of figure out, how much are they going to try and get in camera, and how much are we going to do further down the line. For example, do they want to use diffusion in front of the lens in camera, or do we do that digitally because we've got more control? If they're going for a very strong look, are they using filters, or do they shoot slightly flatter, and then we kind of do more of that in the grade? So we try and have those discussions as early as we can before the shoot, so that we're all kind of on the same page. And then, during the process of the shoot, we'll be in discussion. Maybe there's a particular scene that they've had some issues with on set for whatever reason. Maybe the weather wasn't, behaving because, it was pouring with rain on a summer's day and they lost the light quickly. Maybe they'll send us some test shots so that we can kind of run some tests. Or, if there's something more extreme, like, like a day for night scene. For example, like one of the Black Mirrors I've just done, we graded a whole scene probably 2 months before we actually did the final grade. They shot before Christmas, and there was there's a particular transition of time from late afternoon into evening into night. They were shooting with some GoPros as well as the main camera, and they just had to shoot some of it during the day. And then, we sort of brought those scenes in a kind of early form of the edit, just to see what we could do in the grade, and check if there was any work that needed to go to visual effects. And then any grading work we did, we could hand over to the visual effects team, so they could kind of see, okay, this is how dark we're going to make it. And then, if it's adding headlights on the front of a motorbike or onto the sides of buildings or something, it's all kind of trying to coordinate those different teams together. Because I think sorry to interrupt,
No.
I think our role as a colorist is, you've got all these different elements that are sort of coming together in their final form. We're kind of the last, along with the sound mix, we're kind of the last step in the process where, visual effects are coming in, maybe little changes to the edit, the final sound's coming in, and we're trying to sort of bring all those elements together and sort of tie it all together with the vision of the director or the DP or the showrunner.
Now, you just made me think about, because I started in sound, and I remember one of the most frustrating things at the post house would be like, they would spend all their money as they got closer to you, trying to improve things, and they'd be like, oh, it's going to be a really tight budget. So this is just open question, does that happen to you guys? Like, everyone's just blowing through their cash trying to fix it in post and through VFX? Or
and I think you're always trying to figure out how you can help in that respect. I mean, personally, most of my work now is either long form drama or features. But, over the years, I've done a lot of faster turnaround documentary work, for example, and you learn just to be really fast, for one thing. I've done lots of shows in the past where you get one day to do, 1,500 shots. And at the end of the day, you do a 9-hour day, and then you review it with the client. And then that's kind of it. So, then you kind of go, okay, I need to do 150 shots an hour for the next, and you just go as fast as you can. But that's really helpful, because you learn how to just kind of not be too precious with shot to shot. It's more, you've got to really focus on, how do I make this all feel consistent? And then, yes, a lot of the shows we're working on where there may be a huge number of visual effects, the rig that you mentioned, that was, I think, about 3,500 visual effects shots. But then there's always extra bits. There's always, a boom that somebody's missed, or if it's a period thing, there's one of the Black Mirrors I just did that's set in the late 60s, and there's always little modern day air conditioning units or something in the background. And if it's a locked off shot or something quite straightforward where you can just go in the baseline and just go, okay, I'm good, rather than you going off to visual effects and then spending a bunch more money to get that simple paint out done. If we can do something in the grade just to fix that quickly, then we'll do that if we can. So you're always trying to find ways to just sort of help out in that respect.
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned Black Mirror a few times, and one of my questions for you was going to be, like usually when you're doing a show, there's a consistency across episodes in the sense of this is the look of the show and we're going through season 1 and you can sort of prep yourself. But in Black Mirror, every episode's different because every sort of, wherever we're going with these characters, it's going to be different. So how do you prepare for that? Is there some like sort of elements that are kept from episode to episode, or is it every single one's fresh? You have to start from scratch?
Essentially, it's starting from scratch each time. We always look, every series we've done, we've treated every episode like a little mini feature, right through from the kind of the whole color workflow, the amount of visual effects work, the team. You need a big team of people in the post-production company to help out, whether it's the assistants, the visual effects editors, the producers, all kind of coordinating everything. The one consistency with Black Mirror is Charlie Brooker as essentially the showrunner. And so you have different directors and DPs each time. I mean, there's a handful of directors and DPs who've done multiple episodes over the seasons, but Charlie is really the ultimate guiding voice. So the kind of early stages of each episode is really just me and the DP or the director just having a chat, going kind of what's the script, and each time you get a script for that show, it's always a big surprise just what the subject matter is going to be. This series just gone has moved away a little bit from the kind of classic Black Mirror sort of subject matters around, technology and that kind of dystopian near future kind of idea. And there's more kind of horror ideas and, more sort of set in the past as well. So each episode, you really just sit down with the DP and go, you kind of how are you looking to approach this? And then we just try and go from there. And for the most part, because all those discussions happen early on, Charlie's usually pretty on board with where the direction is going. And we'll try and set some looks early in the process so that what they're seeing in the edit is somewhere in the direct, whether it's a LUT or something, to kind of guide the edit in the direction of where the grade is ultimately going. And that does change sometimes, but he's the kind of, we'll do all the grading work and then he'll come in and review it. And he sometimes you'll run an episode and he's like, yeah, great, that's fine. And then other times it's usually like key scenes that he's got a very particular sense on. I mean, actually, there was one episode this season just gone where there was one scene in the Lock Henry episode that was, out of everything that may or may not have been a challenge that you might try and predict for, there was one scene which is like it's like a fake trailer for a true crime documentary. And that sort of 3-minute section was probably one of the most challenging elements of the whole series. And it's a really kind of deliberately kind of lo-fi, creatively, it looks, it's all kind of like garbled images and fuzzy text. And Matt Curtis has designed all these text elements to lay over, graphics to lay over the top. And that, because he had such a specific idea of how he wanted to look. And it wasn't about, they'd shot all these drone shots of the Scottish Highlands that are kind of beautiful, kind of 4K, super sharp images. But actually what he wanted was something much more lo-fi and kind of degraded. and
Mhm.
you know, he preferred the look of the, you know, the compressed quick times to the high res, and it's like you had to kind of really rethink your normal, you know, normally you want to
Yeah.
be working with absolutely the best source images you can, and in this case you had to kind of rethink that a little bit.
So did you guys end up using the compressed QuickTimes in there to try and
For a few bits, because it was like, because you know, we'd sent him some tests for him to review on his laptop, and the early tests were using some of the older footage, and he just liked the way that worked.
yeah.
And you know, you sometimes you can kind of overthink it and try and, okay, this is the proper way to do it, but actually if that's creatively what you like, then just do that.
Well, it reminds me of, I remember talking to the editor of District 9, and they got all the VFX shots when they go into the alien ship for the first time. And they were too clean and perfect. And, you know, there was all these complaints about it's too clean, it's too clean. So the editors went to his assistant and they output to VHS and then output to VHS and then output to VHS and then captured that. And then the director was like, that's perfect. That's what I wanted. And so that's what's in the final film.
Yeah, and I think you know, I remember when we started season 3 of Black Mirror was the first one on Netflix where it became a 4K show rather than HD, and you know, a lot of the discussion was about, you know, taking those 4K images, and people are always looking at ways to sort of dirty the image up, whether it's adding film grain or diffusing things. You know, on the Demon 79 episode we've just done, we you know, we made the first few shots we were trying to look like kind of, you know, old reels of film where, you know, when you go and watch a film in the cinema and the trailers would come on and they'd all be kind of wobbly and scratchy. We wanted that kind of feeling. So often we're trying to look for ways to dirty the images up, you know, and you know.
Now, in the latest season, the episode that everyone seems to be talking about is Joan is Awful. And so I was rewatching it today, and I was wondering, because I was noticing that like each of the scenes have very distinct looks. So I was wondering, did you guys have a plan for an arc for the colors in that episode, or did you take it scene by scene, or how did you approach that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because obviously what you find out at the end of that episode, you know, just not wishing, well, I'm going to spoil it a little bit for people watching this, but assuming people have watched it, what you find out towards the end of the episode is you're not in the kind of first rung of the ladder of these kind of fictive, I can't remember what they call them, fictive levels of the show. And there's these different versions of Jones. And so it does become a bit of a thinking process of, well, what does that mean in terms of the color for that level of the show? And you're also thinking about, you know, because whenever you're thinking about the tone of a show, you're thinking what's the general mood, what, you know, what mindset are the characters in? Is there a way we can reflect that? You know, if it's a very dark scene and, you know, people are going through a lot of troubles, then maybe you're more desaturated and darker. You know, and if it's a very happy scene, maybe you're a little brighter, more colorful, but, you know, on a very simple level. But in this, Joan, as you meet her at the start, she's going through she's going through a pretty rough time, partly of her own creation, but she's not in a great place. But also we're actually, as we discover, one level up from the kind of original Joan. So Charlie wanted it to have a slightly more saturated look than we may have treated it if it had just been kind of that one fictive level throughout. So we ended up actually dialing in more color into, you know, so that when she's sat in her apartment with her fiance and they first sit down to watch the Streamberry show, we wanted that to feel quite rich. And so that when you look back on it, actually she's in a slightly unreal world and it's slightly away from reality, because actually you discover that she's in this kind of AI generated you know, version of her life.
Now, what's your sorry, go on.
No, it's okay, Karen.
Well, it's not an important question, but what's your go-to or your favorite Black Mirror episode that you had to work on? Because you've worked on a lot.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think of the most recent series, can I nail it down to one? Demon 79 and Beyond the Sea were ones I particularly enjoyed, because I like Demon was great just because of the 70s setting, and there was a lot to play around with in terms of different looks and referencing kind of old Italian horror films.
Yeah.
And there's a sequence where Nida, the main character, she smashes this girl's head through this glass counter, and the idea was, she has these sort of fantasy sequences, but the first few shots, when it happens, you don't necessarily know instantly that it's, it could really be happening, and then you sort of build up the look into this when it gets more and more unreal. And we were sort of looking at Suspiria and kind of Dario Argento movies where they kind of really bold colors, and sort of talking to Stefan, the DP, kind of going, well, what elements can we take from that and kind of start introducing them. So it's always fun working on shows like that, where there's elements you could really get your teeth into. I mean, the Bandersnatch interactive episode was a massive challenge, but very satisfying to work on. And I'm not, the funny thing about that is, when I talk to people, I'm not sure it comes across just how hard it was to work on that and how different it was from a normal episode. Being interactive, just, we had to, from all departments, from them shooting it on set to the edit, to the post, every element had to be kind of rethought, because the interactive side of it just made it 100 times more complicated.
Yeah.
So it was really hard work, but very satisfying when it all kind of got delivered.
Well, it's like in between video game and movie, basically, where you guys found yourself.
Well, I remember when we were working on season 4, Charlie said to me, because he's really into his video games, and we were talking about adventure games. I used to love the Monkey Island series of point and click adventures, and we were sort of talking about that, and he said, well, I'm working on this episode, and he said, do you want to see the script? And then he pulled out this massive sort of bit of A1 paper, and it had this sort of flow chart with all these scenes joined together with arrows. And he was like, well, this is what I'm working on. And, the Netflix engineers had to build a whole new piece of software to make it work. And Charlie would change his mind about, okay, at the end of this scene, what happens next? And you kind of change the order of events, and it would break the software and it would crash. And, it's just all these elements that you're just not used to on a normal show. Yeah. But it was a lot of fun trying to figure it out.
It's crazy because, like, I've talked to people who've written scripts for video games, and they use spreadsheets, like, so that they can communicate with the coders. So it's like, if they do this, then we do that. Yeah. So I'm sure he probably showed them the the sort of flow chart, and they were like, you just put it in a spreadsheet.
I think it nearly broke everybody involved.
Wow.
But we got there.
It was, I guess, I don't want to say it was worth it, because you don't want to break people at work, but it was enjoyable. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that happened for me when watching Black Mirror is I watched the first few seasons, and then I basically took a break for a couple of years because it was so depressing. So if you're working on this day and night, or day in and day out, what do you do to decompress or get off the sort of like heaviness of some of the episodes?
I mean, to be honest, when you're working on the show, because you see it from its earliest form, and then it kind of builds up. I'm not sure that it has, that in some ways that strips away some of the the darker elements that you ultimately see. Sometimes it's only when you kind of watch the final. We had a screening of the Beyond the Sea episode at the BFI a few weeks back, and sometimes it's only when you kind of see it with an audience in its final form, and whether you really get a sense of how it's working in that respect. But outside of work, I try and most of my free time is spent hanging out with my kids.
Yeah.
You know, in the summer, working out in the garden, playing some guitar, that kind of thing. You know, and I watch a lot of movies, and I try and I try and watch like quite a broad range of different films and TV shows, because it's always it's interesting to see what other people are doing on shows, and also it's good to kind of go back and watch some movies from the 70s or something, and just kind of refresh your brain about what films look like 40 years ago or something.
So I have one last question for you. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch?
Well, I was trying to think about this, because I don't feel that guilty about any of the stuff I watch, even if I watch a whole range of different things. I mean, the guiltiest pleasure I've probably been watching recently is Quantum Leap, because that's a show I used to watch with my dad when I was a kid, and I was allowed to stay up late to watch it. And they've been re-showing it on one of the channels. So I've been kind of enjoying re-watching old episodes of that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this week. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com, or of course on Twitter at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Raquel. Thanks for watching. This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs.